My husband's brother tried to prove our daughter wasn't his. While Marcus lay in a coma, he didn't expect the DNA test, the old will, or what happened when Marcus finally woke up. I need to preface this by saying that 6 months ago I would have told you my brother-in-law was just a little cold and bad with emotions, the kind of guy who forgets birthdays and answers fine to everything, and I would have made every excuse in the world for him because that's what you do when your husband loves his brother, even though his brother has never once made it easy to love him back. And I want you to understand that context before I tell you what he did to us the week my husband almost died, because none of it makes sense unless you understand that I spent 9 years training myself not to see it coming. My name is Elena, I'm 32, I teach 3rd grade at a public elementary school in a mid-sized Ohio town you've probably never heard of, and my husband Marcus is 35 and works as a structural engineer, the kind of job where he spends half his week on job sites in a hard hat checking whether the bones of a building can hold the weight people are about to put on it, which is a detail that matters later because irony has a cruel sense of humor. We have a daughter, Sophie, who was 7 at the time all of this happened, a fierce, funny, gap-toothed kid who takes after Marcus in almost every visible way, except that she has my hazel eyes and my mother's reddish-brown hair instead of his black hair and near-black eyes, a detail I want you to file away because it becomes the hinge this entire story swings on. Marcus has one sibling, an older brother named Grant, 39 at the time, a real estate broker who used to be the golden child of the family, valedictorian, football captain, the one everyone assumed would be the success story, until his development company collapsed spectacularly 3 years before any of this happened. A strip mall project in a neighboring county that went bankrupt mid-construction and left him drowning in personal guarantees on loans he'd co-signed, a fact he never told anyone in the family except, apparently, Marcus, who quietly helped him with a loan I didn't find out about until much later. I'm telling you all of this up front because I think it matters, because grief and greed don't come out of nowhere. They come out of years of somebody quietly keeping score, and Grant had been keeping score against his little brother his entire life, watching Marcus get the engineering degree, the stable marriage, the daughter, the modest but comfortable house, while Grant's own second marriage was falling apart under the weight of his financial collapse, and his wife Renee was already talking to a divorce attorney, though I didn't know that piece yet either. It was a Tuesday night in early spring when it happened. Marcus had been out at a job site 40 minutes from our house, inspecting the foundation work on a new medical office building, and he called me at 6:15 to say he was leaving and would be home in time to help Sophie with her spelling words before bed, and that was the last normal conversation of my old life, because at 6:52, a delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection of Route 9 and Miller Avenue and hit the driver's side of Marcus's car going approximately 45 miles an hour, and I know the exact numbers because I have read the police report more times than I can count, memorizing it the way you memorize scripture when you're trying to make sense of something that has no sense in it. A woman walking her dog saw the whole thing happen and called 911, and paramedics got him out using the jaws of life because the driver's door was folded in like a soda can, and by the time I got the call from the hospital, not from Marcus obviously, but from a nurse using the emergency contact information from his phone, he was already in an ambulance being rushed into surgery for a traumatic brain injury and internal bleeding, and I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone with Sophie's spelling list still on the counter in front of me, the word beautiful half spelled out in her round 7-year-old handwriting, and I could not make my legs move for almost a full minute. The surgery took 9 hours. 9 hours of me sitting in a waiting room with my mother, who had rushed over to sit with Sophie and then insisted on coming with me once a neighbor could take her. 9 hours of watching a clock that seemed to be actively working against me. 9 hours before a surgeon named Dr. Patel came out in scrubs still damp with sweat and told me they had stopped the bleeding and relieved the pressure on Marcus's brain, but that the swelling was severe, that he was in a medically induced coma to protect what brain function remained, and that the next 72 hours would tell us more than anyone could tell me right now. She used the phrase, prepare for the worst, in the gentle, practiced way doctors use it, a phrase designed to soften a blow that cannot actually be softened, and I nodded like I understood, though understanding and accepting are two very different muscles, and I was only capable of the first one. For 3 days, I barely left the ICU waiting room, except to shower and to lie next to Sophie at night, pretending I was asleep so she wouldn't feel how much I was shaking. My mother stayed with us. Marcus's mother, Diane, a widow in her late 60s with a bad hip and a heart condition of her own, came every single day despite the 40-minute drive, sitting by Marcus's bed and reading to him from an old paperback like he could hear her, and I loved her fiercely for that in a way I don't think I'd ever loved her before. And then on day 4, Grant walked in. I want to describe this moment carefully because I've replayed it so many times that I could recite it like a script. He walked into the ICU waiting room in a pressed navy blazer, not a hair out of place, carrying a coffee from the hospital cafe like he'd stopped to enjoy the walk over, and he did not hug me. He did not ask how Marcus was doing in any voice that suggested he actually wanted to know the answer. He sat down across from me, set his coffee on the little side table, and said, "So what's the situation with his life insurance policy? Is it through his firm, or did he set up something private?" I genuinely thought I had misheard him. I asked him to repeat it, half hoping he would hear himself and backpedal, and instead he clarified, patiently, like he was explaining something to a child, that if Marcus didn't make it, or came out of this not all there, someone needed to be thinking practically about the estate, about who would manage the house, the cars. Marcus's half of a small engineering consulting side business he'd started with a college friend 2 years earlier, and about whether I had given any thought to power of attorney. My mother, sitting 3 chairs down, actually stood up out of her seat, and Diane, Grant's own mother, told him in a low, furious voice that his brother wasn't even 48 hours out of a coma-inducing surgery, and he was talking about wills in a hospital waiting room. Grant apologized in the flattest possible way, the kind of apology that isn't actually sorry, just annoyed at being caught, and left 20 minutes later without ever going in to see Marcus. I told myself it was grief manifesting strangely. I told myself people process fear in different ways. Some people cry, and some people retreat into logistics because logistics feel controllable when nothing else does. I was, in hindsight, an idiot, but I was an idiot out of love for my husband and a desperate need to believe his brother wasn't actually as cold as he appeared, and I think that particular flavor of denial is one almost everyone in a crisis is guilty of at some point. 3 days after that, Grant came back. This time he wasn't alone. He had a manila folder tucked under his arm, and I noticed before he even opened his mouth that his hands were shaking slightly, not with grief, but with the particular nervous energy of a person about to do something they know is indefensible and have decided to do anyway. He sat down across from me in the same chair, and without any preamble at all, he said he'd been thinking a lot and that he didn't believe Sophie was Marcus's biological daughter. I laughed, actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound, because it was such an absurd thing to say that my brain simply refused to process it as a real accusation at first. He didn't laugh. He opened the folder and pulled out a printed photo of Sophie from a Christmas card we'd sent his family 2 years earlier, and pointed at her hair, her eyes, and said that neither of those features tracked with Marcus's coloring or mine, not really, and that he'd always had a feeling, but never said anything out of respect for the marriage, and that given the current circumstances, given that Marcus might not survive, or might survive with permanently diminished capacity, he felt a responsibility to the family to make sure nobody was being taken advantage of. He used the word trapped. He said it directly to my face in a hospital waiting room 4 days after his brother nearly died, that he thought I had trapped Marcus into marriage and fatherhood to secure financial stability, that Sophie might be, and I remember this word specifically because it took my breath away like a physical blow, someone else's kid, and that he intended to formally request a paternity test through legal counsel to protect what he called the family's interests regarding inheritance, guardianship, and the disposition of Marcus's assets if the worst happened. I did not cry in front of him. I want that on the record. I sat very still, and I told him that Sophie has my grandmother's hair and my mother's eyes, traits that skip generations, something any biology teacher could explain to him, and that I had never in 9 years given him or anyone else a single reason to doubt my fidelity, and that if he ever said anything like that in front of my daughter, I would make sure he regretted it. He told me, almost gently, in a tone that made my skin crawl worse than his earlier coldness had, that he wasn't trying to be cruel, that this was just business, and that his lawyer would be in touch. I later found out from Renee, his soon-to-be ex-wife, who called me 2 weeks later in a fit of guilt and fury after their own marriage imploded, that Grant had been drowning in debt from co-signed loans related to his failed strip mall development, that he was facing a possible lawsuit from one of his former investors, and that he had convinced himself, in the particular self-serving logic of a desperate man, that if he could establish grounds to question Marcus's mental competency and simultaneously cast doubt on Sophie's paternity, he could position himself as the more legitimate family member to control Marcus's assets, including a life insurance payout and a stake in the consulting firm, while Marcus was unable to speak for himself. It sounds insane typed out like that. It felt insane living through it, but grief, apparently, opens doors that greed is more than happy to walk through, and Grant walked through it wearing a blazer and carrying a manila folder like he was closing a real estate deal instead of trying to dismantle his comatose brother's family. True to his word, 6 days later, I was served with paperwork. Grant, through an attorney named Wendell Cho, had filed a petition seeking a court-ordered paternity test for Sophie and simultaneously petitioning for a review of guardianship and conservatorship arrangements regarding Marcus's estate, citing concerns about the integrity of familial and financial representations, legal language dressed up to obscure the fact that his own brother's wife was being accused, in a court filing, of fraud. My attorney, a soft-spoken but formidable woman named Rosalind Ferris, who Diane had actually recommended, told me the paternity claim itself was almost certainly going nowhere on its legal merits, since paternity has no bearing on Marcus's guardianship or Sophie's standing as his legal daughter under our marriage. But she also told me something that took the wind out of me. Fighting it would take months, would require depositions, would put Sophie's name into a courtroom, and Grant clearly had enough money, or enough desperation, to make it ugly regardless of whether he could win. So I made a decision I've gone back and forth on ever since, though I don't regret it. I told Rosalind to let Grant have his test, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted this circus over as fast as humanly possible, so I could spend every ounce of my energy on the only thing that mattered, which was sitting beside my husband's hospital bed, holding his hand and talking to him, even though the doctors weren't sure how much, if anything, he could hear. We did the test at an accredited lab 2 towns over, a place with fluorescent lighting and forms in triplicate, a cheek swab from me, one from Sophie under the gentle guise of helping the doctors understand Daddy's accident better, because I was not about to tell my 7-year-old that her uncle thought she wasn't really her father's daughter, and one from Marcus himself, taken by a hospital phlebotomist while he lay unconscious, his chart now containing a note that still makes my stomach turn every time I think about it. The results take 2 to 3 weeks. Those 2 to 3 weeks were, without exaggeration, some of the worst of my life, not because I had any doubt about the outcome, but because every single day I sat in that hospital room, Grant's accusation sat there with me like a fourth presence in the room, an ugly little parasite feeding on what should have been a private, sacred vigil. Meanwhile, Marcus's condition was, thank God, moving in the right direction, slowly. The swelling in his brain began to subside on a scan taken about 10 days after the accident, enough that Dr. Patel and the neurology team decided to begin very gradually reducing the sedation to see how his brain responded, a process they described to me as extremely cautious and extremely slow, because bringing someone out of an induced coma too fast can cause more damage than leaving them under. So what followed was an agonizing stretch of days where I watched for the smallest signs, a twitch of a finger, a flicker under closed eyelids, and tried not to read too much into any of them. It was during this stretch, almost exactly 2 weeks after his ultimatum in the waiting room, that the DNA results came back. Rosalind called me personally instead of letting the lab or the court do it, which I will always be grateful for, and she read me the number over the phone in a voice that I could tell was trying very hard not to sound smug. 99.97% probability of paternity. Marcus was Sophie's biological father, as certain as modern science can make anyone certain of anything. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and cried for the first time in almost 3 weeks, not from surprise because I had never doubted it for a second, but from the sheer release of finally having irrefutable, undeniable, laboratory-certified proof to throw back in the face of a man who had tried to weaponize my own child against me while my husband couldn't even open his eyes to defend us. Grant's reaction, when Rosalind's office formally notified his attorney, was reportedly to demand the lab rerun the test, convinced there had been some kind of contamination or clerical error, a request the lab politely declined, given that their protocols already included duplicate chain of custody sampling, specifically to prevent that kind of dispute. He asked for a second independent test at his own expense. It came back 99.98%. At this point, Rosalind, and I will love this woman until the day I die for the sheer theatrical precision of her timing, decided it was the right moment to deliver the second blow, the one Grant hadn't seen coming at all, because in the process of reviewing Marcus's estate documents to respond to the guardianship petition, she and Marcus's estate attorney had pulled his most recent will, filed and notarized about 4 years earlier, roughly a year after Sophie was born. What that will revealed was this. Marcus had an older will, drafted shortly after he and Grant's father passed away, and before Marcus and I were even married, that left 40% of his estate to Grant, a decision made at a time when Grant was still the golden boy older brother Marcus idolized, and their relationship was, by all accounts, close and uncomplicated. But after Sophie was born, Marcus quietly updated his will, a fact he had apparently never told Grant, or me either, honestly, and the new document left 100% of his estate, the house, his retirement accounts, his half of the consulting firm, everything, to me and to Sophie, with no provision for Grant at all. Rosalind delivered this information to Grant's attorney in writing, dryly noting that regardless of the outcome of any guardianship petition, Grant held no legal or financial stake in Marcus's estate whatsoever, paternity questions notwithstanding, and that his entire legal campaign of the last 3 weeks had been fought over an inheritance he was never going to receive in the first place. I wasn't in the room when Grant found this out, but Diane was, because she'd insisted on being present, and she told me later that her older son went so pale she thought for a moment he might actually be sick, that he asked to see the will himself, read it twice, and then, without saying another word to anyone, walked out of the attorney's office and didn't answer his phone for 4 days. Diane cried telling me this part, not for Grant's financial loss, but because she said it was the moment she truly understood how far far apart her two sons had drifted, and how much of that distance had been Grant's own doing. Built brick by brick over years of quiet resentment she said she'd sensed but never fully confronted. During those 4 silent days, something else was happening that mattered far more to me. The hospital's clinical social worker, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Denise, who had been checking in with me weekly, sat me down to walk through the financial realities of long-term traumatic brain injury care, and the number she gave me, $30,000 to $40,000 in costs likely to fall outside our insurance coverage over the coming months, covering things like inpatient rehabilitation, specialized cognitive therapy, and equipment, landed on me like another small earthquake. And it was in that meeting that the full, cold weight of what Grant had almost done finally hit me. If his guardianship petition had somehow succeeded, if a court had frozen Marcus's assets or handed any measure of financial control to Grant, while he contested paternity and competency, I might not have been able to access the funds to pay for the very care that was keeping my husband alive. Also, his brother could chase 40% of an inheritance he was, as it turned out, never entitled to anyway. That thought kept me up more nights than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. Then, on day 16 of the reduced sedation, everything changed. I was sitting in my usual chair beside Marcus's bed, reading him an article about a bridge collapse in another state, because Denise had told me familiar voices and familiar topics can help, when I noticed his eyelids flutter, not the random twitching we'd seen before, but something deliberate, and then his eyes opened, unfocused at first, drifting, and I stood up so fast I knocked my chair over, and I said his name, and his eyes moved toward the sound of my voice, and, after what felt like the longest 3 seconds of my entire life, found my face and stayed there. He couldn't speak yet. There was a tube, and even after it came out days later, his words were slow and slurred from the trauma and the disuse. But he squeezed my hand, weak but unmistakable, 3 small pulses, and I completely fell apart in front of the entire ICU nursing staff, and I don't regret a single second of it. The following weeks were a blur of small, hard-won victories. A physical therapist getting him to track a moving light with his eyes, a speech therapist coaxing his first real word, my name, which I will treasure until I die, the tube coming out, him recognizing Sophie in a video call, and the way his whole battered face seemed to soften even though the muscles barely cooperated. It was around this time that Grant resurfaced. He called me directly, which he had never once done in 9 years of marriage to his brother, always going through Marcus or texting only about logistics. And when I saw his name on my phone, I almost didn't answer, but some part of me wanted to hear what he had to say, if only for closure. He was quiet for a long moment before he spoke, and then he told me he'd been in therapy, actual therapy, twice a week since the will revelation, and that he had spent his entire adult life feeling like the family's disappointment standing next to his younger brother's easy success, that watching Marcus build a stable marriage and a happy kid, and a career that didn't collapse in a spectacular public bankruptcy, had curdled something in him over the years that he hadn't fully admitted to himself until his therapist made him say it out loud in a session, and that when he got the call about the accident, some ugly, panicked, desperate part of him had seen an opening. Not consciously, he insisted, not calculated the way it must have looked from the outside, but he wasn't going to pretend it wasn't there. He apologized. He used the word ashamed. He said he understood if I never forgave him, but he wanted me to know Renee had left him, that he was in outpatient treatment, that he was trying, genuinely trying, to figure out why he'd become a person capable of accusing his own niece's parentage in a hospital waiting room while his brother lay dying 20 feet away. I listened to all of it, and then I told him that I appreciated him saying it, and that I hoped therapy helped him, and that none of it changed a single thing about how I felt. And I hung up the phone, because an apology delivered after the DNA results and after the will was read is not the same thing as an apology delivered because you actually thought better of your own cruelty in real time, and I wasn't interested in giving him credit for regret that only arrived once every other option had been exhausted. Marcus continued improving steadily over the following weeks, moving from the ICU to a step-down unit and then to an inpatient rehabilitation facility, and it was there, about 5 weeks after the accident, that Grant showed up in person for the first time since the will reading, asking Diane to broker a short supervised visit. I almost said no. I talked to Rosalind about it. I talked to my own therapist about it. I talked to Marcus's rehab psychologist about whether it might set his recovery back emotionally, and in the end, I decided that the choice belonged, as much as it could, to Marcus, who by then could form full sentences slowly and deliberately, even though the words still sometimes came out sideways from the injury. When I explained who wanted to visit and why, Marcus was quiet for a long time, and then he said, haltingly, that he wanted to hear it, that he wanted to look Grant in the eye while Grant said it, not because he needed the apology, but because he needed to see for himself what kind of man his brother had let himself become. We agreed to 15 minutes, supervised in the rehab facility's family room, with me present the entire time. Grant came in looking smaller than I remembered him, not physically but in some indefinable way, like the confident posture he used to carry into every room had been replaced by something more tentative. He sat across from Marcus, who was in a wheelchair at that point, still weeks away from taking his first supported steps, and Grant cried, actually cried, not the performative near tears I'd seen in the waiting room months earlier, and told Marcus everything he'd told me on the phone. The jealousy, the debt, the panic, the ugly opening he'd seen and taken. Marcus listened without interrupting, his face unreadable in the particular flattened way brain injury sometimes leaves people. And when Grant finished, Marcus said, slowly and carefully choosing each word the way he had to choose all his words now, that he heard him, that he believed Grant was sorry, but that sorry didn't erase what he'd tried to do to Sophie, to me, to their mother, while Marcus himself was unconscious and unable to protect any of us, and that he needed time, real time, not a 15-minute hospital visit's worth of time, to decide whether there was still a brother relationship worth rebuilding, and that no matter what he decided about that relationship, Grant was never, under any circumstances, going to be involved in decisions about our family or our finances again, a boundary Marcus stated in a tone that, despite the slurred, careful cadence of his recovering speech, left absolutely no room for negotiation. Grant nodded, thanked him, and left. And to his credit, he has, in the months since, respected every inch of that boundary, communicating occasionally through Diane, sending a card on Sophie's birthday that I let her open, but didn't push her to respond to, staying entirely out of our day-to-day lives in a way that at least suggests the therapy might be doing something real. Sophie, for her part, had her own difficult road through all of this that had nothing to do with Grant, and everything to do with watching her father go from the man who used to throw her in the air in the backyard to a stranger connected to tubes and machines who couldn't talk to her. For the first several visits after he woke up, she froze at the doorway of his room and refused to come any closer, and I don't blame her one bit. Brain injury is disorienting even for adults who understand what they're looking at, and for a 7-year-old it must have felt like her father had been replaced by someone wearing his face. The rehab facility connected us with a wonderful pediatric psychologist named Clara, who specialized in helping kids process a parent's medical trauma, and over several weeks of sessions, some just for Sophie and some with all three of us together, Clara helped her build back a sense of safety around her dad, one small interaction at a time, first just being in the same room, then holding his hand, then eventually climbing carefully into his lap the way she used to, and by the time Marcus came home 10 weeks after the accident, Sophie had appointed herself his official helper, announcing his physical therapy exercises to him from a printed schedule like a tiny, extremely bossy coach, which made both of us laugh for the first time in what felt like forever. The recovery at home was its own long, unglamorous marathon. Outpatient physical therapy 3 times a week, occupational therapy to relearn fine motor tasks, speech therapy that gradually smoothed out the last hesitations in his sentences, a walker that graduated to a quad cane that graduated around the 4-month mark to a simple cane he mostly used out of caution rather than necessity. There were setbacks, a bad fall in month 3 that scared us both badly, weeks of frustration when his engineering brain, so precise and reliable his entire career, couldn't hold on to numbers the way it used to, a period of depression that his rehab team had warned me was common after severe TBI, and that we worked through together with a therapist of his own. But the trajectory, slow as it was, kept pointing in the right direction. By the 6-month mark, almost exactly half a year after that Tuesday night phone call that ended with, "I'll be home in time for spelling words," Marcus no longer needed the walker at all, using only a simple wooden cane for longer distances, and it became, without either of us really planning it, our new morning ritual. Marcus walking Sophie down our street to the bus stop every single school day, her hand in his free one, chattering about whatever 8-year-old drama had unfolded at recess the day before. Him listening with the same patient attention he'd always had, just a little slower now, a little more deliberate, but unmistakably, entirely himself. I watch them from the front porch most mornings with my coffee, and I think about how close I came to losing him, and how a different kind of loss, quieter, uglier, harder to name, had been circling us at the exact same time, wearing my brother-in-law's face and carrying a manila folder, and I think about how the two things that saved us both turned out to be the same two things all along, the undeniable, unbreakable, laboratory-certified truth of who we actually are to each other, and a decision my husband made years before any of this happened, quietly, without telling anyone, to put his family first.